On the Civil War of St. Louis, we'll take a look at the impact and the progression of the Civil War here in what is now the middle of America. Our series will be, for the most part, location-oriented. We'll take a look at what happened in and around St. Louis and exactly where. But we begin with an overview of the social and political climate in the state of Missouri prior to and during the war.
So the program we're going to do today is from the other point of view, so to speak. It's a Confederate spy.
At the Missouri History Museum exhibit, The Civil War in Missouri, Special Events Coordinator and actor Barney Bradshaw plays a Confederate soldier who returns to St. Louis years after the Civil War, when he learns part of the Gratiot Street Prison is going to be torn down. The prison was located at 7th and Gratiot on what is now the campus of Ralston Purina. This is just south of Busch Stadium.
Perhaps you weren't here when the Civil War ravaged Missouri. You know, many men were states' rights men, such as myself. That's not to say that I believed in slavery. I simply said that states had the right to dictate what went on within their own borders.
Bradshaw's Confederate character testifies being a prisoner of war in a state claimed by both the Union and the Confederacy was anything but civil.
The place was horrendous, meant to hold no more than 500 people. It was seldom that there were less than 800 men here, sometimes 1,000 or 1,500. Men from the U.S. Sanitary Commission, their own people, Union men, came here to inspect it. They thought the floors were earthen, they were so filthy. Men here died by the score. Do you know that there are currently 1,000, over 1,000 Confederate graves now at Jefferson Barracks Cemetery here in St. Louis? Where did those Confederate graves come from? The closest battle to St. Louis is some 90 miles away at Fort Davidson. That was a Confederate victory. Where did 1,000 Confederate soldiers, how did they wind up to die here in St. Louis? Prisons like this, that's where. Gratiot Street Prison, Myrtle Street Prison, Alton Prison.
This is kind of the introduction to the gallery. And what we wanted to do here was we really wanted to show the myriad of viewpoints that existed in the state. That while kind of strong forces on either side of the debate over slavery and secession forced people into two camps.
Exhibit researcher Danny Gonzales explains how museum officials tried to capture the Civil War era tone of a state like Missouri and a city like St. Louis.
Here we have a broadside that would have been posted around Alton, Illinois, that advertises for a steamboat to give a ride down to St. Louis to see an execution of these four men who had committed various crimes. They had committed various crimes, but the interesting thing was the conversation around the state was not as much about their crimes as about how their crimes influenced and interrupted slavery. There was a paranoia, if you will, about the power of slaves to organize and resist. I mean, that was a real fear with slave uprisings taking place in other parts of the country. So we really wanted to show how St. Louis became different, how it became a Union bastion, but do that without kind of alleviating it from any guilt around slavery.
We were fed twice a day, primarily by food that was still moving as they placed it onto your plate. The plates were nailed to the table. No knives or forks or spoons were ever issued, while the food was served up and eaten with the tools that God gave you. I understand once in a while they would come by with buckets of water, try to keep the rats and the vermin at least onto the floor.
And how scary and how just uncertain this time must have been for people. You think about someone knocking on your door in the middle of the night. You look out and someone dressed in a Union soldier's uniform, and you ask them, they ask you what your loyalties are. And your thought would be to say, I'm pro-Union. They're wearing a Union uniform. But you never know, it could be a guerrilla dressed as a Union officer. So you really have this incredible sense of uncertainty. Loyalty is very ambiguous, and that's kind of what we wanted to explore in this next section, is this kind of ambiguity of loyalty and the difficulty and kind of haphazardness of enforcing loyalty. In many cases, if you knew somebody important, you were treated better than if you didn't. So the ways that loyalty was enforced are listed up here. You had the least severe were fines or assessments. You could potentially be imprisoned, and this is an image of Gratiot Street Prison, which today would be located near Purina.
The men were so filthy here, we had a game. We used to place bets on it. It was called odd or even. You would put your hand within your coat and then pull it out and count the lice. Were they odd or were they even? A betting game for people so sick that they could barely stand at times. The food horrendous.
So this painting by Andy Thomas, who is a contemporary painter, depicts a guerrilla charge. You have these guerrilla warriors on horseback, and it really shows the style of warfare that they were doing. It was very quick. They would ride into these raids with weapons that they could shoot from horseback. A lot of times it was revolvers, a sawed-off shotgun, something that they could pull out quickly and discard quickly and get out of that situation. It's interesting, you know, they had no uniforms. They wore whatever was available. But over time, a culture and a style emerged for guerrillas. You had kind of this embroidered overshirt, floppy hat. If you look at Bloody Bill Anderson, one of the most notorious guerrillas here, his outfit kind of embodies this kind of style that is created around guerrillas. So these guerrilla warriors, they had a variety of motivations. Some of them really wanted to see Missouri join the Confederacy, that without Confederate troops occupying or fighting within the state, they saw themselves taking on that role. They didn't want to go to the South and fight the Union in South Carolina, in Georgia, somewhere else. They wanted to fight for the state of Missouri. Others saw it as an opportunity to get rich. They were raiding homes, they were stealing, they were plundering. Some of them were looking for excitement. Some of them were drawn in by strong personalities, like Bloody Bill Anderson here, like William Quantrell, like Sam Hildebrand. But all in all, they ended up committing these atrocious acts and creating, again, this war of no quarter within Missouri. This flag from a Union regiment has the words, "No quarter asked, rebel, none given," again reinforcing this idea of a war of no quarter within the state. To combat guerrillas, a new militia was formed called the Enrolled Missouri Militia. Now this was a militia that you were required to join. This wasn't a volunteer unit. So sometimes you had people who were disloyal joining the unit. But it was used to control guerrillas in these areas. They were formed from the area. They stayed in the area that they were formed, and they used whatever weapons, whatever uniforms, whatever supplies they had. They would only come into action when they were needed, when there was a guerrilla attack.
Bradshaw's Confederate character lends credence to the notion that Union and Confederate clashes took their toll on residents of St. Louis and Missouri.
Against one of these men, a personal grudge, my friends. There is nothing civil about a civil war.
So now we know what it felt like to live in and around St. Louis during the Civil War. But what exactly took place here, and where did it happen? Tune in next time when we set the stage for Civil War in America at the Old Courthouse.